Good afternoon. I am Marvin Curtis, president of the South Bend Symphony Orchestra, and this is the Invisible Player. What you're going to see right now is a 10-minute trailer that we have produced for a 90-minute documentary on the life of Rosemary Sanders, as well as other topics. And so sit back and watch this 10-minute version of The Invisible Player. In looking at histories of orchestras, the documented first African-American player was in 1946. Rosemary was 1940. We may have a historical piece here.
To know that there was an African-American female musician playing in an orchestra for years, but being hidden.
She studied in Chicago. She auditioned for the symphony in 1940, got in. As the only black player, they put her in the back of the second violin section last year, but did not put her name in the program for 15 years. If you look at her history, it's amazing. Her mother worked for the Oliver family, which was at that point one of the richest families in town. Gertrude Oliver, the daughter, took a liking to her and gave her piano lessons and gave her violin lessons. So I went and found her obituary, because she died in 2017. And in the obituary were her two children's names listed. So I went to Facebook and I put in her son's name. He wrote back and he said he was Rosemary's son, that his sister had all the material. He would get me in touch with her. Eventually her and I started to correspond with each other.
Mr. Cunningham would just let her go all through the mansion. She could go in any room. She could go up in the den and play the piano, and I think that's where the music really started to really become part of her. Gertrude had a violin, and she brought her violin out because she used to play it in the mansion. And my mother would listen to her and watch her play. And she said to Mrs. Cunningham, "I want to play that." And she said, "Well, all right." And I would imagine it wasn't long after that she offered to give her the Stradivarius violin.
Everyone knows Stradivari. If you don't know much about violins or classical music, most people know Stradivari. And all I can say is it's an earned reputation.
I really think that Miss Gertrude Cunningham, because of her heart of gold, wanted to do something for my mother Rosemary that would really be huge and big, to try to replace some of the rejection, coming to South Bend with TB and having to be in a sanitarium for a year, and all of these things that she experienced. I really truly believe that was her capacity to love, why she did that.
So, when your mom joined the symphony in 1940, what was her feeling about being the only black person in there?
Well, you know, as you can see depicted in all of the pictures, her being almost out of sight, hiding in the background, felt a sense of rejection, and I was always wondering, you know, how long do you experience that before you become so used to it?
I discovered that of the big five, they each had a first African-American player, usually in the 60s, 70s, and the last one to get a black player was Chicago, which surprised me, and the year was 2002. So all these years, the Chicago Symphony was an all-white orchestra. It wasn't until 2002 they hired their first black player, and they were the last of the big five to do that. I was just shocked. I was shocked. Growing up in Chicago, knowing all the people in Chicago who were black musicians, that we were never, we meaning African Americans, were never a part of. It goes on to sort of say to me, you have a problem. And why is it that in 2024, we still have so few African Americans as players in symphonies?
In her time, orchestras probably were at 1%. And now, 80 years later, orchestras are barely at 2%.
There was one situation where I had invited a guest. We were sitting in the box. So as my guests approached the door, they were questioned by someone else who was in the box if they were supposed to be there. The person continues to ask if they're in the right space. By this time, I have now come in and I am now intercepting. They are with me and they are exactly where we are supposed to be.
No one could understand why Josh Jones, principal percussionist of the Calgary Philharmonic and the Grant Park Festival Orchestra and the Kansas City Symphony, was fired for playing a crash cymbal too softly. Although it's been a year since this has happened, this feeling is still visceral because of how wrong it was. Knowing that people intentionally lied about my work, about what I love about this business, it still hurts. I think every time we get a different version of the exclusion that has been part of our field, it causes somebody to learn something new or see something current in a different way.
I read about a foundation that provided funds to support violinists. And I tried for 2 years to get an appointment with the person who was chair of the board. Finally, I got the appointment. I go to see him. He walked in to his office. We shook hands, and as I'm lowering myself to my seat, he looks at me and he says, "I had no idea you were black." And my initial response was, of course, anger. I'm like, what the hell? But my dad had taught us, when someone says something to you that knocks you off your feet, but it's unexpected, don't respond right away. Just take a deep breath. So I just decided to listen. Then he went on, he said, my wife and I have been going to the Aspen Music Festival for more than 30 years. We rarely see any black violinists. Why is that? So we had this really engaging conversation. I was able to tell him about a young black violinist who had come to Texas, and I got the money I was looking for.
The best weapon you have against prejudice, the best weapon you have against the lack of representation, against any of the social circumstances you will encounter, is to be the best violinist in any of those rooms you walk into.
If I could meet Rosemary Sanders, I would tell her how much it means to me that she stayed. That she stayed on stage in spite of all the things that she went through. And I would give her a big hug.
That's the most inspiring thing about Rosemary, that she wasn't limited. The 30s was limiting for everybody, but she wasn't limited by it. She broke through so many barriers and glass ceilings that most of us can't even comprehend today. We're still having trouble breaking through the glass ceilings and barriers that she broke through in the 1930s. What does that say? Is that an indictment on us and our time now? Or does that speak to the testament of how forward-thinking and progressive she was?
Good afternoon again. I'm Marvin Curtis. I am the board president for the South Bend Symphony Orchestra, the first African-American board president in 92 years. Just retired as the dean of the School of the Arts at IU South Bend. And now, my current job now is the coordinator of Arts Equity and Public Art for the city of South Bend. As board president several years, and I was chair of the EDI committee at the symphony, and through our education director, I was given an article about Rosemary Sanders about two years ago, and the interesting part was that nobody knew about her. There was an article in the file cabinet. It was a celebration of her 93rd birthday, which was in 2015. And she passed away in 2017 at the age of 95. And when I was given the article, I said, I read it, I thought, there's a lot missing here. So I began the investigation. And I want to introduce to you two young men, Chuck Fry and Ryan Belaski. You guys, Chuck is the director, and Ryan is the cinematographer. And my partner in crime on the end down here, Justice Zimmerman, who's the executive director of the South Bend Symphony for 2 more days before he leaves for Austin, Texas. And I talked about how to make this reality. And so this project started a year ago with an interview with Rosemary's daughter in Vegas. And then I came here to Sphinx and interviewed Kane and some other people, and we have now done 32 interviews of African-American artists and not only players, but administrators who have graciously given us their time to talk about the invisible player. So the premise of this is threefold. The first part of it is to talk about Rosemary's life. She came to Chicago, she came from Chicago to South Bend when she was 5 years old because she had tuberculosis. And there was this tuberculosis center in South Bend. But her aunt, Helen, worked for the Oliver family, which was one of the richest families in town. And she was the head of the household, so she paid all the bills with cash. And she and her husband took Rosemary, because Rosemary's mother was in Chicago. They had two daughters. And when Rosemary came to South Bend, it was decided that she should stay with that family because the parents could not afford to raise both daughters. So Rosemary stayed with her aunt, and it was through her aunt and Gertrude Oliver Cunningham, who was her employer, who was one of the richest women in town, who was married to the head of the bank, who was one of the richest men in town, that she was introduced to music and to the arts. And the story continues that Rosemary then went on to not only learn how to play the violin, but to play the piano, sing, and in her high school days, Gertrude bought her a Stradivarius violin, which unfortunately has been destroyed by fire, but that was a gift to her, and she grew up in this household. This is more, the story keeps going on and on and on. But in 1939, she graduated from high school in South Bend and auditioned for the symphony in 1940, got in. And the assumption now is because the Oliver Cunningham family was wealthy, and Mrs. Ella Morris, who was the president of the symphony board, was wealthy. And all these wealthy people were supporting the symphony. And Rosemary had studied with a student of the concertmaster of the symphony that they let her get into the symphony. She auditioned and got in. She was a very fine player, but they put her in the second violin section in the very back. And because she was fair-skinned, she sort of fit in and was the invisible player for 15 years, and they never put her name in the program. And she was never allowed to really be photographed with the orchestra either. And so that's where we got started. And so my quest was, how did this happen, first of all? And why are there so few African Americans in symphony orchestras? And in the film you see, we talked about the Big Five, which was Cleveland, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and New York. I could forget New York. And they each got their first black player, but Chicago was the last one in 2002. And I grew up in Chicago, and I went to the symphony. But it never dawned on me that there weren't anybody black playing. And I finally met the young man, Taga Larson, who was a trumpet player in the Chicago Symphony. He's the first and still the only black player in the Chicago Symphony. And in Chicago, there are all these musicians I know, but that's how things work. So our panel is going to talk about various things, and I'm going to pass the microphone to Nick right here. Nick was for 33 years the principal second violinist at the South Bend Symphony, but he also runs a music festival in Michigan City, which is about 45 minutes from South Bend. And as I looked at why we weren't in orchestras, why we were not in positions of power, stories popped up. And Nick has a story that I think relates to what we're talking about. And so I'm going to pass it to him. And then, Katie, you're in the wrong place, but that's all right. We said Mary Corbett will be next, and she's with the Florida Orchestra. Kanan goes with the league, and on the end is Justice Zimmerman. So I'm gonna let Nick talk about his experiences in Michigan, and some of you will probably be able to relate to a lot of this. But the question is, how do we solve the problem?
Hello, everybody. As Dr. Marvin Curtis said, I'm Nick Orbovich. Right now, I'm the artistic director and founder of the Michigan City Chamber Music Festival in Michigan City, Indiana. Michigan City is a small town, and there is a large African American community there, working class, and it has suffered the same fate many small Rust Belt communities have. And the population has diminished. I was living in Chicago, met my wife. She was living in Michigan City. We bought a home there, and I kind of decided with some colleagues of mine from around the country, let's try and start a chamber music festival here. So we saw the challenges there. You know, this wasn't Aspen. This was not a Chautauqua. Many different types of challenges. And really from day one, I wanted this to be a community festival. I wanted to get audience members from everywhere. The Hispanic community, the African American community, you know, the small Asian community that we had. And as we started, I remember the gentleman here saying back in the 1930s they were at 1% and now we're at 2%. Well, we've had that kind of, if you want to call it growth, ourselves in audience. I've always taken my inspiration from community. You know, whatever was happening in the world, in our community, I wanted the emotion of our performances to reflect what's going on. And if there's music that the people can relate to, the kind of struggle, whether it's Beethoven or whether it's Jesse Montgomery, you know, we want to play that music, and we always have. After the murder of George Floyd. You know, there was an uprising. There was kind of a grassroots movement, you know, for equity, diversity, and inclusion, far overdue. But there was a lot of people that were talking about it. It seemed, you know, very, very, very important, and it is. We, at my festival, had always included artists, female artists, minority artists. I had a season then, not too long ago, a couple years ago, where we were going to highlight music, as I said, from traditionally underserved communities. And it was African American, it was women, it was from the LGBTQ community, et cetera, et cetera. And as I put this out, along with Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, a lot of very familiar music, I got an angry email from our second biggest donor, who also took the liberty of speaking for the largest donor, saying that this was unacceptable. And how dare I exclude the great masters of music to put in this lesser music of underserved community. And they were especially offended by the night of music by African American and African European composers. Anyway, I had known Marvin for 15 years from his involvement with the South Bend Symphony and me being a player, and we've worked on outside things together. He knew that this was a passion of mine. And I talked to him, and I said, Marvin, can you help me? Marvin came to Michigan City for that individual night of music that had music of Jesse Montgomery, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Florence Price, Joseph Bologna. It was a fantastic program of exciting music. You know, we're not just plugging in music by African American composers. It was all great music. I asked Marvin if he would talk to the audience about why these programs are so important. And he did. And he talked beautifully. It was inspiring. And he grabbed our audience and he didn't let them go and received a standing ovation, instant standing ovation, with the exception of 4 donors in the front row, people that sent that letter in. I'm still getting pushback, and we have lost donors that really were pretty significant. But it is very important that these performing organizations, like mine, do not bend, that continue to move on. Yeah, I've had to go out there, and I've had to look for more money from other places, and it's going to keep happening. And this year, we're highlighting music of female composers, of all races, of course, and we're not going to stop, showing people the greatness of music. As Faha said, opening night, you cannot have excellence without representation. Beethoven, Mozart, they all needed that representation at some point. So that's my story, and I thank you, Marvin, for helping us out that night.
Over to me, Marvin. Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Corbett, violinist with the Florida Orchestra. I'm so grateful to be here this evening. So this has been a magnificent opportunity to share some of my experiences as an invisible player, I suppose. It's kind of a synchronicity that I happen to be on the panel at all. Dr. Marvin didn't know that I was actually associate concertmaster in the South Bend Symphony back in the 80s. So, and as he pointed out, the program doesn't mention, next to my name, black musician. So it was really kind of a mystery, and I was indeed invisible. So it was kind of an interesting synchronicity in being able to kind of share the experience of what it's like to be the only black musician in a symphonic orchestra. Damari McGill was our principal flute for 3 or 4 seasons back in the early 2000s, but for over 30 years, it's been me. Counting heads in the audience when we would perform just about any piece at all. When we play music of African American composers, it has not, unfortunately, seemed to draw many more black faces. And of course, that kind of surprised me. it disappoints me. And I wish that we had the magical solution, what it is that we need to do to draw people in to not just symphonic concerts, but an appreciation of what it is that we offer. And I had talked to Dr. Marvin about the idea of attracting African American players to the art form at all. And I had an interesting encounter with a young woman who had a very young son that had come to one of our Florida Orchestra youth concerts. We do that regularly, many times a season, to raise appreciation and consciousness of what we offer, and to create audiences for tomorrow and the love of the art. And so the young man had come home to his mom and said, "Mom, I really want to play the violin, but there's no one that looks like me." And that always makes me choke up when I tell this story, because, you know, as Nick had mentioned, you know, there's no excellence without representation. But if a child doesn't know what's possible, if there's no sense of hope and vision of what can be, so I guess I was kind of hiding in the back that day. He didn't see me, but if I'd known he was there, if I could have spoken to him, if there are other children that experience the same thing, it breaks my heart to know that the desire for a child is there to be able to make the magic that I feel that I'm able to do. I was blessed with an opportunity of being, I kind of consider myself a unicorn. My parents made great sacrifice to provide me and offer me opportunities that I wouldn't have had perhaps in an inner city school in Buffalo in the 70s. We moved to a northern suburb of Buffalo, New York, which had a magnificent string program, magnificent youth orchestra. I had wonderful familial support and encouragement, and therefore opportunity to do whatever it was that I wanted with my instrument that I love so much. So it's something that's not offered to everyone, and it's I realize how unusual it was, but it is interesting when I encounter people and the look of shock and surprise when I tell them that I'm a musician and they say, "Oh, you're a musician? Are you a singer?" It's like, "No, actually, we do other stuff." So we can play other stuff. So, but it's amazing that it seems so strange. People are always so shocked and surprised that I play the violin and that's how I feed my cat. But it's been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to share my strange experience, my strange journey as of an invisible player, of strangely counting heads in the audience, to see, you know, when we bring a black musician to the orchestra, there may be in a house of 1,700, 5 to 7 people, and I'm including myself in that number. That's a very small number. But of course, I've joked with people saying, "Well, it's hard enough to bring white people to concerts." So I don't know. Audience development is always a challenge for everybody, no matter what the situation. We're always trying to put butts in seats. So, but at any rate, it's been just a real honor for me to be on this panel and to be able to kind of participate in this way. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Mary. Hi, I'm Kane Thomas Enritis. I'm here representing the League of American Orchestras. That's where I'm the Vice President of Inclusion and Learning. I'm also a flutist. I live here in Metro Detroit and had the privilege of being a fellow in the Detroit Symphony for 2 years, more than a few years ago. But so this is a special place for me, and it's great to have everybody come here annually. So thank you for being here. With the League of American Orchestras, for anybody who's not familiar, we are the membership and service organization for orchestras across the country. And not every orchestra, because they actually do have to choose to join, but a lot of orchestras, somewhere in the ballpark of 600, of all budget sizes, all geographic areas. One of our great statistics is that I think we're in every congressional district. That's our advocacy colleagues rely on that, the fact that there are orchestras in every single congressional district. So when anything like national policy-wise is happening, we have people everywhere, like literally. Some people don't realize how many orchestras there are in the country, but there's really about 2,000 these days of all different sizes, youth and adult, professional, community. So we serve and advocate for and champion and support in every way we can a lot of those orchestras. one of those ways, one of those really important ways, is helping us all achieve our goal of making orchestras a place where we all feel welcome. That's on stage, that's in the audience, that's on staff, that's on the board. Orchestras don't need to be and shouldn't be a place where some people feel welcome and other people feel, at best, unfamiliar sometimes. It's something that, you know, growing up as a flutist and growing up as a musician and just fortunately always feeling like orchestral music was my music. It's sometimes hard for me to imagine what it would be like to live with that experience of like walking into a concert hall and feeling like this place isn't for you. And you're not just imagining that. There may be people telling you to your face, like, why are you here? You see that over and over again. People in the audience, ushers, the parking attendants, whatever it is. If you don't fit whatever the norm for that venue is, people question you. And that's something that we can do much better than, I think. So with the League, we try to provide lots of opportunities to figure out what is a better way of doing things, what is a good way of doing things, what is a successful way of doing things, and get as many people as possible to do that. So we have, sometimes we have funding programs. We have something that was called the Catalyst Fund. It is closing out its tenure. That's wrapping up 3 years of the Catalyst Incubator Program, which was providing orchestras with some funds and resources and a lot of community building. A lot of that supported by Aaron Flagg, who happens to be in the audience and is a board member of ours. That's a really strong community of orchestras working very hard on a number of issues across the whole spectrum of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And each orchestra kind of has their own goals, their own reason for being in that program, and our job is to support them in that. Part of that Catalyst program is something that now we brand as the Catalyst Guides, and these are guides that we've been creating for the field of orchestras for a while that share these success stories. Like, here's something that is working for this orchestra. Here's how they're diversifying their repertoire. Here's how they're diversifying their audiences. Here's a way to do artistic planning in a different way. Here's how we can get into very specific strategies for working on musician diversity. That's one that's coming up. There's a lot of nuts and bolts that go into running an orchestra, and sometimes a great idea and a lot of motivation isn't enough. You need some blueprints. You need to know what's working. So we try to do a lot of sharing of that, and we're fortunate that those get a bit of traction. Some other things that we do, we've got a relatively new program called Inclusive Stages, and this is one that, of course, speaks to the very heart of this story about Rosemary. This program is specifically about increasing the racial diversity of orchestra musicians, and that has, as has been talked about, that's kind of been a long time goal and of far off achievement. I think we're not close to that yet. We have a lot of amazing musicians who, like Mary here, have the privilege and the burden of being exceptional. They are the one or the two, and we want that to not be the case for these next generations of musicians. So we are committing ourselves to, in these next 3 years, within this coalition of orchestras that we've created, to really figure out ways to improve recruitment, improve retention, improve the actual work experience for people, to have tenure decisions go fairly and clearly and transparently with accountability, for auditions to be absolutely as fair as possible. And sometimes we take for granted what we think is happening in orchestras. So one example is we will often, anybody who's been in the orchestra world has heard for their entire life that, well, auditions are fair because they're screened. And that means that the committee hearing you can't see who you are in an audition. And that's just kind of become gospel that that's the case. And that is the case many, many, many times. But there's actually a lot of times where that's not actually the case. Or there's a screen for some of the rounds, but not the final round. Or, it's not the dogma that we think it is. And that's not even to say that in any of those individual cases, what is happening is specifically wrong, because I don't know what that situation is. There might be reasons, who knows. But it's at least not true that all auditions are screened and therefore they're fair. Like that's just not an actually truthful statement. So we need to make sure we are understanding what the environment is if we're trying to change it. So in Inclusive Stages, we've got a lot of actual data collection so that we can understand what's actually happening, a lot of sharing of best practices. We're hoping to really ramp up a lot of recruitment opportunities. Not sure if anybody here attended or was connected to the Sphinx Orchestral Partners audition that happened earlier this week, but that's an amazing recruitment opportunity for orchestras where there's essentially a mock audition competition. And from about 300 applicants from across the country that tried to get into that audition, they invite, it's like 34, 35, something like that, to come here to Detroit and be part of this mock audition on stage in Orchestra Hall and in some of the other spaces. And if any of you have taken an orchestra audition, you know that is never easy. It always feels like the spotlight is on you. Anything you do wrong will be noticed. It's like, it's high pressure. And these are high stakes because there are some serious orchestras that are listening to these recorded auditions and making decisions about inviting these musicians to their auditions, offering them work, all that kind of stuff. It's a high stakes, controlled environment. And I sit there and listen to several hours every year, and it is amazing how high level it is. Anybody that wants to know if there is talent out there, listen to those recordings and you will hear it. It's incredible. So there's recruitment opportunities like that. We want those to be used more, and we want more of them. We want more chances for more musicians to prove their worth for these positions, and for the chance to audition, and for the chance to be advanced, like there are lots of other opportunities in the orchestra world for that. So those are just a couple of our programs. I could make this an entire session about the league, and I'm not going to do that. But if you have questions, let me know. And always, you can go to AmericanOrchestras.org, which is our League of American Orchestras website. And there's lots of information there, including a resource center specifically for equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's data, there's reports, there's programs, all kinds of stuff. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being here at Sphinx. And let's just keep going.
Hi everyone, I'm Justice Zimmerman. I'm the Executive Director of the South Bend Symphony for 48 more hours, and then I will be the CEO of the Austin Symphony. And before Dr. Curtis kills me. And I guess my job up here is to talk about maybe the specifics of how this film project happened. I think one of the things backing up this is that there's a lot of emotions right now after this last election. And there's, in gatherings like this, there's a lot of shared feelings about the inequities in the world and what's wrong with the world right now. But Michael Jordan said, work ethic defeats fear. And so coming off of the murder of George Floyd, Dr. Curtis and the South Bend Symphony and myself kind of got to work not knowing how it was going to turn out, and overhauled the board and overhauled a whole bunch of things. But one of the things that we did was we started exploring film as a way of expanding the South Bend Symphony's reach. We defined the mission of the South Bend Symphony more broadly than we put on concerts for this small Rust Belt town. We defined the mission as how many people can we reach with our music? And that opened us up to the ability to do film and not just live concerts. It opened up our interpretation of what we were serving up to people and who we were serving it to, which is why we're here at all today. And so actually with the guys that stood up earlier and a couple other people, this is actually, I think, the fourth film that we've worked on together in really less than 4 years. We're turning the symphony into a production house. So, but it's all been in the spirit of exploration and curiosity, what it looked like to tell these stories, and at least for my part, having hopefully a lot of humility and thinking I don't know the answers, and hopefully Marvin does, and so far so good. So part of that, I was in a session earlier today, maybe some of you were there, on the how to broaden the philanthropic net and to get support from more than just old rich white people. And one of the things they talked about is that philanthropy obviously is a relationship game. In South Bend, the organization had not invested a lot in developing those networks of people of color with resources to support these sorts of projects. And so we couldn't start from zero and go asking for lots of money for these film projects, which meant we had to go to the same well that we normally go to put on our concerts. And it meant communicating stories like this in a way that is appealing to a broad audience and not just because it's the right thing to do. I mean, I think we certainly felt that we were making all this noise about DEI and about what was happening in the world, and here we had discovered a case in our very own organization of inequality and of wrong that the organization had done. So we had to live up to that. But we also had to convince our conservative donors that we were making a play to make classical music better for them. We were making a play to make music better, and that involved convincing them and using the language of skill and talent is universally distributed, and our industry has done a grave disservice by keeping some people out and not encouraging some people, and we have all missed out on the experience of the music that would have been created had we been more inclusive as an industry. I think it's really interesting that right now in this politically fraught time, a couple of the big banks, JP Morgan Chase and the other guys, not places known for just doing the right thing because it's the right thing, but they're sticking by their DEI initiatives because they feel like there's a really strong business case for that. And it's not always fun to make the business case when you feel like there's a moral reason for doing what you're doing. But my job has been to make the business case for DEI, and I think that we've done a good enough job that we continue to produce films and get to be on this panel, and hopefully there's a lot more to come.
Part of this story is about how we've made progress, but also how we've not made progress. And how do you change the landscape? How do we tell the story of Rosemary Sanders, who was a part of the South Bend community that nobody in South Bend knew about? How do I change history? If you put in first African American player in Google, up pops James Burrell from Denver, Colorado in 1949. Rosemary was 1940. But nobody knows that because her name wasn't listed. And so my job is to change history a little bit, but also to show young people and the community, here's somebody that we overlooked for all these years, and how do we fix that? The goal of this project is not only to create a film, we hope to be about 90 minutes long, and hopefully win some film festival awards, make people aware, but also to take that film and use it as a fundraising tool to endow the third chair in the symphony in Rosemary's name, rather than the last chair, the third chair. The first two have already been taken. So that third chair will be forever the Rosemary Sanders chair. And that is, so that's part of this whole story. And so it's not only, and so many of us have been the invisible player in our schools, in our orchestras, in our choirs. We've been the only person in the room. And we sometimes have to share that burden. Rosemary, for those 15 years, never complained. She played. She went to Chicago for lessons at the Sherwood School of Music. We discovered in the process that the South Shore train, which she took, was a train that was segregated. So she and her mother had to sit in the colored car in the 1930s and 40s going to Chicago. I ride the South Shore train all the time. And trust me, I'm not sitting in the colored car. That doesn't exist anymore, but it did. And those are things that people need to be aware of. And so as we look at the invisible player, we're trying to tell the story of a woman who survived all of this, but also why are we not in those orchestras? So part of the film, it talks about, we've interviewed musicians as to their stories. And the third part of the film is what Justice was just talking about, and how orchestras can reconcile themselves and say, we have those stories that we have not told. that we need to tell, so people see, so young people can see that that a person like Rosemary survived all of these things and still was successful.
I think speaking of questions, it's time for the Q&A.
Yes, sir. In your last official role.
There's a mic out there. Yeah.
Hello? Awesome. There we go. Do you have a question?
Thank you. My name is Tayo Aluko. I'm a playwright and actor and singer, and I'm wondering whether, maybe in addition to the film, you envisage somebody performing a play about her.
Yes, actually.
Yes.
So our illustrious music director is fond of performing concerts in costume as, you know, the 15th Bach child, and explaining Bach in a very approachable way to the audiences. And we're already working on a concert format about Rosemary Sanders. Now, our white British music director will not play Rosemary in that stage adaptation. There's some but yeah, so we're looking at a dramatic representation of this paired with music.
The other thing is that we've commissioned a young black African American, or a young black woman, to write music for the movie, and so that piece is to be premiered next February. So we have work to do to finish the film, but she's a young violinist in South Bend, one of my former students who got her master's from us. So we're trying to involve the community in that way. So she will be writing at least a 10-minute piece for the film that we will use to show off her talent as well. So it's not just, so as Justice said, it's more, we're trying to be as open and creative as possible, which also takes money, but we're going to find it.
And her name is Jessica Carter, if you get a chance to listen to pieces by her. We've commissioned a couple things because they're so fantastic.
She's very excited about it, too.
Any other questions?
Thank you for this. I was not aware, so I'm learning as well. And as you were talking about, obviously this being a film and a play in this age of Netflix and Hulu and all of those kind of things, is there aspiration for pitching this? I see heads nodding, so I guess the answer is yes. But immediately as you started talking about it, that's where my mind went. So I was just curious if there are plans for that.
I'll let you, since you're leaving me, you can give your take.
I mean, I think our aspirations are extremely high and probably unrealistic, but I think it would help all of us if the film got an Oscar, right? And if Netflix did decide to run a miniseries on it, imagine how many more people we could cover. But in all seriousness, yeah, I think we'd like to push it as far as possible. We think, you know, we want this to be a story about the orchestral world. We're all aware that our industry has been talking about this for 30 or 40 years and not much has changed. And so highlighting that is maybe not doing something new, but starting from the very specificity of Rosemary's story, that's good storytelling. So make it really specific so that we can talk about a broader issue. And we hope that has legs and that can get wider traction.
We've also done, as of today, 32 interviews. And so I have enough stuff to do a mini-series on people, because the stories are so compelling of all the people that we've interviewed, not only musicians, but administrators. My good friends there from Cleveland, as you saw her on the screen, was one of the people we interviewed because she is your title is Equity. For the Cleveland Symphony. The story she told about the opera was unbelievable. But I've experienced that where people don't think you're supposed to be where you're supposed to be. And we included that because it was so compelling. But there's a lot of stories about that. And so I think we have an opportunity to show not only Rosemary's story on this side, but if we really get creative, there's so many stories that not only we're telling, but are not being told, that we need to find out about. We didn't know that Mary was in the symphony. We just happened to have this conversation for the panel, and she said, "Oh, by the way, I was in the South Bend Symphony." Really? When? 87 to 89. We had no idea. She was probably the second black person in the symphony. But we didn't know that until this panel came up, because there's no record of that kind of information. South Bend Symphony has two African American players right now. One's violin, and one's in a bass, both females. And they came 95 and I think 98. But we didn't know about Barry. So I got another story to tell, and she has a compelling story herself. So there's so many, one of the things that I think we're urging people is to go back to your orchestras and your communities and find out those people that we have been overlooked, that you may know about, and do that little research. It did, Facebook and Google worked for me to get to where we are now. But there are stories out there that need to be told, that people need to know about, that will enhance our history.
Good afternoon. My name is David Burnett, and I'm a violinist and photographer and teacher. And I know at one point, why they're laughing is I was one of the people that was also interviewed for this. Thank you. Good to see you. And I lost my train of thought for a brief moment. But what I was going to say was, Mary, when you were talking about putting on concerts and having black repertoire under the programs and not seeing the draw, I can tell you right away how that can be rectified. And we did it actually. I'm a contractor, and I also contracted an orchestra called Soulful Symphony. A lot of people know because I hired a lot of them. And we ended up having a residency with the Baltimore Symphony. And the orchestra is about 95% black and 5% Latino. So when Baltimore Symphony heard about us, they came up with the idea of us doing a residency with them. And it was one of them and one of us per chair. And I think I brought in about 45 musicians for that particular concert. And initially, that opening concert, I will tell you, was a little bit, how should I put it, tense, because I guess they didn't know us and we didn't know them, and I'm not sure if they were really wanting us there. But it was really interesting, I'll say, and I'll tell you why I say that, is because my stand partner, he's a Russian violinist, and I decided to break the ice, and I asked him where he studied. He told me he studied in Moscow and so forth. I asked him, "Oh, who did you study with?" He said, "Oh, you probably don't know them." I said, "Well, you never know. Who is it?" And he said, "Edward Grach." And I said, "Oh, of course I know of Guinea." And Edward Grach and his son of Guinea, and I started naming all the people. And he was looking around like he'd seen a ghost. And he said, "How do you know of all these people?" I said, "Well, first of all, my first violin teacher was Russian. And I'm an avid listener. And I have a little bit over 60,000 LPs in my collection. And every major and minor violinist, violist, pianist that you can think of, I know of them." And so he was shocked, and he got up and he ran over to the cello section because his wife was there, and he was telling her, and she was telling another person, and I was watching this happen. It was really funny. And all of a sudden, in that one moment now, when he came back and everybody started talking, the ice was broken. And after that, it was wonderful. And also another thing that happened, that residency was supposed to be for 3 years, and they loved it so much, they ended up keeping us for 2 more years. So we were with the Baltimore Symphony for 5 years. How we got the audience to change its landscape is that we went out to churches and we put on performances with us and had Q&A afterwards and so forth, and that was it. Boom, boom, boom. And next thing you know, literally, there were people standing in the aisles, literally, for the concerts. And so that's why they ended up keeping us there. So if every orchestra could think about having, don't just bring the orchestra members, because if you just bring in people that don't look like the audience, they're not going to come out. But if you want it to change, bring in those African Americans, Latino, women, and so forth, and bring in some of the orchestra as well, and put them in the churches and let them perform. Don't put on things like 12-tone row compositions. that's going to run them off. But you put on things that are accessible, and they will definitely grab onto it because they love music, and that solves the problem. Thank you.
That's terrific, David. Thank you so much. That's wonderful.
Any other questions?
Could I ask, sir, what is the name of your orchestra?
It's called Soulful Symphony, and actually PBS actually did a recording on it's on DVD. So if you ever call PBS, they have it, and they used to give it out when they had their funding drives and so forth. It's called and Soulful,
F-U-L.
yeah, SOULFUL.
I can remember that.
Yes, and the DVD is called Songs in a Strange Land, and it's by our composer who is named Darren Atwater. Very gifted composer and pianist. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, I have a question. You mentioned that you did a lot of interviews with different artists. I was just wondering, was there a common theme or a common struggle that you saw among these artists, and how did it relate to the classical music scene, or just like, environment?
One of the questions I asked almost everybody was how they got started, and there's a variety of answers. And I also asked the struggles they had, and you'll find that some of the struggles were similar. Mary was our last one this afternoon. We just finished up with her, and we talked about how she first heard about music when she was 6 months old, and then took violin at 8. And so a lot of those stories are the same. There was a parent involved. There was a school involved, music education, but there was also, in most cases, there was a struggle with how to be identified. And so those were some of the common themes. And when we get the film done, you'll see some of those common themes. And the last question I asked everybody was, what would you say to Rosemary Sanders if you could meet her? And I've got 32 different answers, but most of them all say that they would thank her for what she did. Kane said something in the film that there was, which we showed, there was an African-American player that was hidden, for all those years, but she excelled. And so that's the struggle that we kept telling this. I kept hearing the same thing over and over again. There was a struggle. There was, how do you become identified? Ronald Crutcher, who's has been president of 2 schools, Boston, Wheaton College in Boston and University of Richmond, told the story about about the donor, and how do you identify as a black person when somebody says to you, "Oh, I didn't know you were black." What's your first reaction? You want to kill them, or how dare you? But you listen, So those were some of the common things of the struggle. And another question I asked everybody was about music education and how do our schools fit in. The other question that I came up with was, you got a football, a basketball, and a violin. What are your parents going to let you play? And how do we change the landscape of athletics as being a way out versus music? Because that's what we all, as Mary said, they think she's a singer. I'm supposed to be a football player. Not going to happen. And I've been, people think I'm a linebacker. Nope, I play piano. So those stereotypes are there also. So those are some of the questions that I asked everybody. So, and as hopefully when you'll see this a year from now, you can see some of those answers. I think they're also within our own lives. If you look at your own life as a musician, how did you get to where what barriers did you get over to get to where you are? And you'll find some camaraderie amongst all of us. I think, are we out of time?
Yep, that was our last question.
That was it, okay. Thank you so much for coming. The website is invisibleplayer.org, and in about a week, you can donate to the project. You can start at $25,000 down to $100, and you will get your name at the end of the film as in the credits. So invisibleplayer.org, And we thank you, and thank you for your coming, and enjoy the conference. Thank
It's
you.
a cheap way to get your name on IMDb.